All right, so in this video, I just want to share with you some of the basic mechanisms behind the health improvements that can come from Tai Chi, and how if these things aren't in place, then the health benefits probably won't come. And how if we can understand these things, then it can actually start to move Tai Chi away from something that's just superstition and fantasy into something that's actually real and tangible and is closer to kind of what the terms and the words actually mean. So unless you're are actively engaged in the process and you can actually do it in your body, well, a lot of what I'll say will sound kind of abstract, which I mean, fair play. I mean, it's kind of just the nature of the beast. And it's something that really always confused and perplexed me for many years, and was something that I really dedicated a lot of my time in my life to try to figure out and understand for myself first and foremost, because I ultimately wanted all the benefits and I wanted the real tangibility, not just fantasy, not just superstition, meaning like, oh, if I just do these movements, then there's going to be some magical healing thing that's going to occur because they're old, or because I learned it from someone in silk robes, or whatever else, which that's cool, that has its place. But for me, I kind of want something a little more tangible. So basically, in the simplest terms, the process is kind of like using your awareness to convert the mass of your body into a fluid like substance that can be moved through your body via a process of release, which leads to an expansion. And basically, in order for this to happen, what occurs is that the tissue layers in your body, of which there's many, separate from the bones and then start to separate from each other, and then be able to move and slide around independently. And the space that is created in that process is what we would call the channel by which that fluid like substance or that force is able to move. And it's basically a way of internally initiating a load or a stress into the system to cause a change in the internal environment of the body. So internal meaning basically everything between the skin and the bone, everything basically on the inside. So the more that those layers separate from each other, separate from the bone, the more space that's created, the more our mass is able, meaning the mass, the weight of our body, is able to convert into a fluid-like substance to move through that space. Then basically that is what people would call Jin or Qi. Within Tai Chi, they call it Jin, but you can also call it Qi because it's something that moves. So basically, the movement and quality of this force is largely what yields the benefits of the practice and gives the body the ability to move gravitational and kinetic forces through the tissue matrix without bearing on the joints or creating compression. More the opposite. You move those forces through the body, and the more they move, the more internal pressure that's created, and the more expansion, the more the tissue layers stretch out and off of the bone and kind of away from each other, the more that is created is kind of the opposite. Because usually when you put force or weight or mass or a stressor into the body, contraction, like if you lift weights, the muscles are contracting, and that contraction is built into the muscle, and then you tear down the fibers regrow back, they get bigger, hopefully they look better, they look more toned and lean, and then you kind of like get a better physique or you get stronger. That is the opposite mechanism of what I'm talking about here, and that's kind of why most people struggle and or likely fail when they're doing these arts, because it's the process that I just talked about, meaning using your awareness to convert your mass into a fluid-like substance that can be moved through the body to initiate a process of change that leads to a release that creates an expansion. That's kind of a lengthy and painful process to get all these layers to separate and to get all the contraction out of the body and out of the nervous system, out of all the different tissue layers. That's where something like standing comes into play, and why standing is usually the foundation of every single system. And the purpose isn't just as an endurance exercise or to whatever other reason. It's large in part this, to basically get things moving, to allow things to actually separate and create space. And then the more space that's created, the more things that can move through it. If there's no space, if everything's bound and wound up together, nothing can move through it. That's just kind of simple fluid dynamics, simple physics at the end of the day. So basically, also I want to clarify that Qi in the context of Tai Chi is different than Chinese medicine, which is different than Qigong, which is different than Neigong, which is different than Feng Shui. It's the same term, but within the context, it means many different things. So it would be a major error to assume that it means the same thing across the board, or that the philosophy underlying Tai Chi is the same as Chinese medicine, is the same as Qigong, is the same as Neigong, and vice versa. Obviously, there's a lot of terms, the same terms that are used, and there is some overlap, but there's actually a tremendous amount of differences, and it's kind of a disservice that a lot of people do is they just lump it all into one category. Now, one of the major similarities that they all have is basically the philosophical axiom, which is where there is free flow, there is health. Where there is constriction and stagnation, there is disease. So basically, the process that I just talked about in the beginning of the video is starting to break up stagnation, break up constriction, break up stagnation and constraint and tissue binding and all of those things, which is ultimately putting us in a fairly relative state of disease and stress and anxiety and everything else. And then opening that up, which is leading to free flow, which is going to be leading to more health. So it's basically just the basic axiom that underlies many of the different arts. If we think about it, most things in life create constraint, constriction, and stagnation. I mean, obviously, like loving relationships and great experiences kind of have the opposite. Of course, it's kind of obvious, but especially in modern times, most things are quite extreme, quite stressful. Especially being on the computer all the time, being on your phone all the time, being on social media, that creates stagnation, that creates constraint and constriction between mostly your optic nerve and your upper neck. But I mean, that as a whole, a lot of people have indigestion because they're constantly staring at screens, which as soon as you do that, it moves more blood up into your brain, which moves it out of your gut, which causes indigestion, which indigestion causes anxiety. Anxiety, it just creates that cycle, right? So if we could just imagine or ask ourselves, what would the outcome be if we freed up all the tissue layers in our body, opened up all the nerve flows and the fluid movements, and then converted our system to release, move, and expand when we encounter an external stressor rather than contract and fixate? Because the stress response is usually for most things. I mean, obviously, the exception being like fight, because it's the opposite. You kind of puff your chest up, everything kind of swells and kind of constricts, and you try to make yourself bigger. But that is also a form of stagnation, a form of tension, and especially chronically over the long term, leads to a lot of problems. So it might in that moment feel like a sense of expansion, but it's kind of not. And it usually doesn't produce the best outcomes unless, of course, it's to check a boundary or something, useful, but that's usually kind of a quick on and then it's off and we kind of forget about it. So, but basically, yeah, getting back to the point, what would the outcome be? How would we feel? How would that probably change our perception and our sense of self and our overall health if all the tissue layers were freed up and separate, and then thereby the nerves open up, which means that our blood can flow better and our other fluids can move better as well. And then instead of contracting when we encounter a stressor, our body actually releases and expands and creates a release, initiates a release that creates an expansion. So, which is kind of the opposite, which is kind of one of the things that say like, oh, Tai Chi is natural and doing internal arts is natural. It's actually unnatural. What's natural is what I just described: as you encounter stress, you constrict, you are born, and then you build up a bunch of layers throughout your life, and then you are more constrained and constricted as an adult. And that's just obvious. If you think about how loose and flexible and open children are, and then how rigid and tight adults are, that's pretty much the only example and evidence that you need to perfectly illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. And you could say, large in part, that these qualities, when built into the body, transfer over to the mind. And then once they're built into the mind, they transfer back over to the body. Meaning, on the positive side, the more our tissue matrix and everything separates and expands and opens, then that creates expansion in the mind. And then the more the mind can expand and release, the more that can create in the body, and then the more that creates in the body, the more it creates in the mind, and it initiates that cycle versus the opposite of like constraint, constriction, stagnation in the body, and then the mind constricts, and then the body constricts, and then that is normal, that is natural, that's how most people live their lives, that's just sort of what is normal for humans. So basically, the body can be a tangible reflection of the quality of our mind, and kind of an anchor point, and more so an objective measurement for whatever our progress might be and whatever our actual attainment of skill might be. And that's one of the ways that Tai Chi has oftentimes had a lot to do with meditation, even though it is not meditation. Mindfulness, yes, for sure, but meditation, no. At least as I've been taught, because I'm, not necessarily at the level of actually approaching traditional meditation myself. But this is why it can have a lot of those associations, because it actually can start positive cycles, which is actually the opposite of normal life. So hopefully, hopefully that makes sense. So again, just to recap, it's using your awareness to convert your mass, meaning the actual mass that this thing has, your tissues, your bones, your skeleton, all the stuff inside of it, converting that into a fluid-like substance that can be moved through the body to create a change via a process of release that leads to an expansion. Tissue layers separate from the bones and separate from each other, and the space that's created in that is kind of the channel or the riverbed in which the force is moved. And it's basically giving the body to the ability to adapt to gravitational and kinetic forces, to be able to move it easily through the system without creating compression or bearing down the joints. Whereas the vast majority of the time, what most people are doing is just creating more compression, and just treating the body like very symptomatically, like, oh, this one thing hurts, oh, my knee hurts, so I'm going to do knee rehab exercise. It's like, okay, but why was your knee over compressed or really out of alignment in the first place? Why? Because gravitational kinetic forces were not able to evenly move through it. It's like, oh, my neck is really tweaked and it hurts. Well, why? Because basically gravitational kinetic forces are not able to move in and out of that area. And it moves into the area, but there's like kinked and it's stuck. So then that creates pain because there's stagnation or constriction there. So hopefully that makes sense and gives a little more clarity and insight on the process, and why I also said previously that visualization and imagination don't really have much role to play and are kind of a waste of time, because they're not doing any of the things that I just outlined in this video. Which, I mean, if that's triggering or upsetting to you, then, well, like, there's a bigger conversation to be had, but that's kind of a different subject for a different time. So hopefully this has been helpful, and I'll talk to you soon.